Thank you so much for joining us here today. Welcome to the Ending Racial Profiling and Police Abuse in the Latinx Community. My name is Araceli Rubalcaba, and I am a UCLA law student. And it is my pleasure to introduce Lourdes Rosado, who will guide us through a rich discussion with our distinguished speakers today. As you will see, there are a couple flashcards on the table in front of you. If you have any questions or anything like that, please jot them down. At around 12:30, we'll be collecting them to hand them off to our amazing moderator. Well, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here at the Latino Futures Symposium. I had the honor of being on the planning committee, and we've been working for more than a year to put this together, and I'm just so thrilled to see the turnout. That voting rights plenary was amazing, and we have a lot of energy. And I'm so glad to see the turnout for this panel, which, for better or worse, policing is a big issue in the Latina community, Latino community, and I think that's why we're all here today. I'm very lucky to be with two colleagues, one new and one I won't say old, but enduring. All the way down on my left is Maritza Perez Medina. She is the Director of Federal Affairs at the Drug Policy Alliance. Please give her a warm reception. DPA is the leading organization in the U.S. that is promoting alternatives to the war on drugs. And we all know, as we'll talk about a little bit more, the war on drugs has a symbiotic relationship with over-policing in our communities. And she's been a really great ally to my organization, LatinoJustice. And to my immediate left is Judge Natalia Cornelio. Am I saying your name right? Cornelio, I'm so sorry, our new ally in this fight. Natalia is the presiding judge of the 351st District Court in Harris County, Texas, which handles felony cases. And prior to being a judge, she served in various legal positions, including a staff attorney for the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and as an assistant federal public defender in Houston. So we're very happy to have them here today. I will say that I'm moderating, but I'm also a contributor. Our panel had a couple of other people on it who both got COVID and could not fly yesterday. So we're going to do, we have a lot to say. So we're like, oh, good, they're not coming now. We would have loved to have them both here, but we know that we have more than enough between the three of us in this whole room to have a very robust conversation about policing. And so I wanted to start off by asking each of you to talk a little bit about your work, both current and past, and how policing and what kind of work you've done to address over-policing against the community. Why don't we start with you, Maritza?
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm so happy to be here. I will say that when I walked into this room, it reminded me of law school, and I haven't been in one of these rooms since law school, so it was a little traumatizing. But maybe I'll have good memories after this, I hope. Well, I started my career, I would say my post-law school career at MALDEF, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, which I think everybody here is familiar with. And I was a Soros Justice Fellow. And if you haven't heard of the Soros Justice Fellowship, it's a criminal justice reform fellowship. It's a public interest fellowship. So if you're in law school and interested in criminal justice issues, definitely check it out. But it's an 18-month-long fellowship that sponsors you at a public interest firm. In my case, it was a public interest law firm, MALDEF. And I got to start the first criminal justice portfolio that MALDEF ever worked on. And that's how I got so intimately involved with LatinoJustice PRLDEF, actually, because there were very, very few Latinos at the time talking about these issues, especially at a national or federal level. But there I really did a lot of crimmigration work just because a huge part of MALDEF's day in and day out work is immigration advocacy. So I really got to understand crimmigration more through policy and advocacy legislation when I was at MALDEF. I was lobbying the Hill. It was a different time. At that time, it was the Obama administration, and actually the Obama administration did implement a lot of criminal justice reform initiatives, and I got to be involved in those, which is really exciting as a new lawyer. But I left MALDEF about a year and a half after joining full staff. I was working on a number of civil rights issues, but I knew I wanted to go back to doing criminal justice reform work because really that was the whole reason I went to law school. I knew I wanted to do civil rights. I knew I wanted to do specifically criminal justice work. So I moved to a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the Center for American Progress, CAP. It's a progressive think tank. Some of my jobs still involved that lobbying and advocacy that I really enjoyed, but a lot of it was also producing reports and thinking about new policy ideas to settle lawmakers across the country. And that's where I really started to engage more deeply in police reform work, studying things like how do we keep police accountable? Can the police be reformed? I also continued to work on immigration, specifically looking at gang databases when I was at the Center for American Progress. And then I really started to get intimately familiar with drug policy, which led to where I am now, actually, at the Drug Policy Alliance. And I've been at the Drug Policy Alliance for about 4 years, going on 5 this year. But I was introduced through that work just through the work I was doing at CAP. At the time, there was the very beginning of conversations around federal marijuana reform. And again, that introduced me to DPA, and now at DPA I'm doing all things war on drugs. So a lot of my work is criminal justice, which I was already familiar with. The learning curve for me was the public health aspect of drug use. We work in both spaces, which has made it really interesting for me because I feel like even now I'm still learning things about drug policy. But I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you all about the war on drugs and the type of legislative advocacy I continue to do in DC at the federal level. So I'll leave it there. Yeah.
A lot to say. Judge, and so I want to say, I think it's always an important thing when you meet first a judge who is a Latina and a judge who's a former public defender. There are so few judges today who are former public defenders and legal aid attorneys who come from doing that kind of frontline work. So I'm especially glad to have you here today. So tell us a little bit about your work and how it has intersected with policing of our communities.
Thank you. So I'm Natalia Cornelio, as she said, the judge of the 351st District Court in Harris County, Texas, which is the county that surrounds Houston. It is one of our 26 felony courts that serves that area. So front row seat to the work of the criminal justice system, felonies in our courts. Before I was a judge, as it's been said, I was an assistant federal public defender, and I also was a civil rights lawyer. So listening to the voting rights panel, I was one of those people who came up wanting to be a civil rights lawyer, wanting to do the law to make a difference. And the reason I ended up as a federal public defender, actually, in Houston, I'm from Chicago, but I'm a bilingual attorney. I wanted to be a public defender. And my work at the Ninth Circuit, I learned about a crime called illegal entry and illegal reentry. And I was like, Mexicans go to prison for up to 20 years for being here illegally? And it struck me like what I had learned about the war on drugs, which is it's a status crime. I mean, we're incarcerating people for who they are, and we're calling it something else, right? It's not being a drug addict, it's drug possession. It's not being an immigrant, it's entering illegally. And the consequences are severe. And I felt like it was personal, it was my people. And so I ended up in Texas. I'm from Chicago. I worked in San Francisco. I went to college in New York. And I ended up in Texas because I wanted to work along the southwest border, front lines to my people being incarcerated. And I thought I knew I was a badass early on. I know all of you know too. I was like, I am an amazing attorney, and I want my people to benefit from an amazing attorney. So I want to be a public defender, and let me do this work. So that's how a Chicana from Chicago ended up in Houston, Texas. People ask me all the time. I just want to comment on this conference. I've never been to anything like this, and just looking at you all, I feel so at home. And I'm 41, and I've been a lawyer since I was 23, and I've never heard of anything like this. So thank you guys for being here and let me witness being a part of this alongside with you and even letting me speak. So before I was married, before I was a judge, I was a public defender. I was a civil rights lawyer. And so now I'm a judge, and it's really special. But I want to start with a big fat disclaimer that my code of ethics, now that I'm a judge, is that I cannot comment on policy. I cannot take a position on laws because they might be before me to rule on. Right. And it is my job to make sure that everybody in front of me gets a fair shot and gets to make their arguments. And so you guys are going to hear me talking, they let us talk in front of the legislator as resources right? And so I'm not advocating for anything. I am simply sharing what I know from my experience, and nothing that I say has anything to do with how I would rule in a pending case or a future case that is before me. But I do want to just circle back that it's still, and it's been a journey for me because of my past, right? And when I started, I was like, wait, I can't say anything about this. I can't have a position on this. And so it's really my own becoming to sacrifice the advocate in me to become a decision maker. But I will say it's been a blessing. It's been a growing experience, and I've gotten to learn to take into account all the sides and still use my experience of having served my people, the people, in deciding how the decisions I make are going to affect them for the rest of their lives sometimes. So that's a little bit about me and my experience with policing and the justice system. I think that the justice system can be violent in ways bigger than just policing. And sometimes, you know, we see the laws and the enforcement of the laws. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the laws that impact our community.
Absolutely.
Without taking a position on it.
Well, Judge Natalia, let me just first say, especially in this environment where unfortunately we see jurists at the highest level accepting rides with billionaires to vacation spots, that we applaud you for your commitment to ensure that you never even have the appearance of a conflict of interest. Thank you for that. That's a really important thing. So I'm Lourdes Rosado. I'm President and General Counsel at LatinoJustice. We were founded as the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. So MALDEF is out here in California. I had lunch with Tom Sands, who's the President and General Counsel of MALDEF yesterday. We're over on the other end. We're based in New York, but we do have offices in Florida and Texas. And I've been working in civil rights and representing people in the justice system now for more than 25 years. And I can say I've never been to a symposium like this as either. So it's just really a powerful moment. LatinoJustice, and I started out personally doing a lot of individual representation, mostly of youth who were accused of crimes and were in either the delinquency system or the adult criminal system. Spent a lot of time trying to keep kids out of the adult criminal system. But at LatinoJustice, one of our pillars of work is around criminal legal system reform, and so we have a big focus on policing. Just to name a couple of things that we're doing currently that are pertinent to what we're going to be talking about throughout this panel is we just settled last year a lawsuit against the Suffolk County Police Department in Long Island. It was an 8-year battle around racial profiling of Latinos there. I want to talk a little bit later about the injunctive relief. We have currently a lawsuit against the New York Police Department to preserve the right of New Yorkers to record police interactions with the public in public places. We're also we also just sued another police department in Long Island around language access. We're talking about abusive policing. Abusive policing also happens when police do not respond to our community when they're in need. And so we do also a lot of work in advocating for laws, for example, laws that require police to record and publish more data about their interactions with the population. And that's what we're going to start off with, is sort of this concept of over-policing. Judge Natalia, can you start us off and talk us, what does the data show us about what is happening? Is this real or is this just anecdotal?
So the bad news is that there's really bad data. As a starting point, including, especially in Texas, Latinos are still classified as white. So we have very little context on the impact of policing on our community. And there's also very little requirements of different law enforcement agencies. So in Texas we have, I want to say, 1 million law enforcement agencies, but in Harris County alone, we have the Harris County Sheriff's Office, we have the Houston Police Department, we have 7 constables precincts that are independently elected constables, and then we have Metro Police. I pointed at my husband because he works for the Metro train system. Metro Police. We have independent school district police. We have university police, and there's not any uniformity or governance or expectations of what they need to maintain and report as far as data. including in 4 situations, right? We have no national databases of people who get fired from police forces. So we have a notorious constables precinct in our county. I won't say who, but the community knows. And people who get fired from HPD or the Harris County Sheriff's Office for misconduct end up at that one.
They call it the notorious constables?
They don't call it that.
No,
They call
but it's known. No. But people call it that.
They're like, oh, that precinct.
Wow.
And the prosecutors, right, in the court will be like, oh, who did the search? Okay, yeah, I'll dismiss it instead of litigating this motion to suppress.
Wow.
So, unfortunately, that's my bad news about data, and I know that advocates have done work there, but it's really hard to get accomplishments and have accountability and information with regards to that.
Brought up a point that I had forgotten about is sort of like, how do we count who's Latino, right? And there is, this is a big issue in sort of tracking data in prisons, like how many Latinos are actually in prisons because they could be classified as white and not, no acknowledgement of their national origin or ethnicity. Because we're in Los Angeles, I went on the internet today to see what I could learn about arrest statistics here, and I went, actually the UCLA Daily Bruin had an article in October of 2023 that looked at data that was recently released by the Los Angeles Police Department. It was arrest data between 2019 and 2022, and it showed that even though Black and Latinos make up about 56% of the population in Los Angeles, they accounted for almost 80% of the arrests. So good news is, compared to when I started doing this work 25 years ago, at least now we have data, and we want more data, and it's more publicly accessible to really, confirm that this is not just our imagination. This is real. And we have the evidence to show people who try to dismiss our concerns. Now, there are a lot of ways that people of color come into contact with the police, or the police come into contact with them, and one of our primary drivers is so-called drug offenses. So Maritza, can you tell us a little bit more in your work, especially at DPA, about how that works, how that phenomenon, how is this war on drugs really just drawing in our community in disproportionate ways into the policing system?
Yeah, so whenever I talk about the war on drugs, I really like to level set for people and just remind people that since humans have been on this earth, people have used drugs. People have used mind-altering substances, substances for healing, including our ancestors. This isn't anything new. Since humans have been on this planet, we've been using substances. And if you think about it, there are some substances that we use every day, like coffee and nicotine, that aren't criminalized, like some other substances that are. So I just like to say that to remind people about that, because I think that, culturally, we view drug use as a moral failing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to level set with that. And then I also just want to remind people that when the war on drugs truly started, it started to attack communities of color as an excuse to deport, arrest, incarcerate, and surveil people of color. In fact, the first drug laws that we saw in the U.S. were born in San Francisco, and those were anti-opium laws that targeted Chinese migrants. At the time, this is late 1800s, early 1900s, Chinese migrants were business owners. They were workers, but lawmakers started to say that they're coming after white women specifically. They're coming after your jobs, and this was a way to deport and surveil these communities, shut down these communities. Later, soon after that, actually, we saw the same thing happen to Mexican Americans in marijuana, actually. And this was a targeted decision that the federal government made to actually go after Mexican American communities and Mexican migrants for deportation and again to arrest and surveil these communities. In fact, marijuana itself appears in the federal code, but before that, people referred to it by its scientific name, cannabis. And now you're seeing a return to that, but it was intentional. The person who was in charge of drug policy at that time at the federal level said, we'll call it marijuana to make it sound Spanish, to make it sound more scary, to associate it with Mexicans specifically. And we saw the same thing actually with crack cocaine. The first time crack cocaine became illegal was in the 1930s. And that was specifically targeting Black men in the South who sometimes did use crack cocaine because they were working in terrible circumstances. I should say cocaine, the plant. But they did it as a way to like actually do the work that they needed to do. It was very, very difficult work. But again, it was used as an excuse to, really stigmatize and demonize certain communities. Then we come to President Nixon, right? So Nixon, this is 1960s, 1970s. He was the first president that we really saw put a name to the so-called war on drugs. It was the first time that we saw the federal budget balloon, and we saw the Drug Enforcement Administration come out of this, the beginnings of it. And since then, every president has actually dedicated more funding, and every Congress has criminalized more substances, which led to mass incarceration. And actually, this is a very famous quote from a policy advisor to Nixon admitted that the reason that they were doing this was to target the so-called hippies and black activists who were actually agitating for basic rights, for civil rights, right? So I want people to remember that our communities were targeted from the very beginning, and it's worked. Because if you look at the federal, state, and local level, who is serving time for any type of drug law violation, it's Black and brown people, even though we know that drug use is rampant in white communities as well, right? So it's very, very intertwined, and unfortunately we see the results of that continuing to this day.
I also wanted to reflect on it's when people are also in crisis because of drug use or mental health issues or both, that they come into contact with the police. And I think it's also been in those situations where we've seen the greatest number of police killings, when police are responding to people who are in that kind of behavioral health crisis. And I think I know that there is a movement, and we are certainly among those who are really advocating that police are not the right people to respond to people who are in drug crisis, mental health crisis, that there are, in most situations, really the better response is by trained clinicians, civilians, social workers, and that we also need to create more places for instead of the automatic default for taking someone who's in crisis to the police station, that there have to be alternatives, alternative ways to process them. In speaking of police killings, obviously there's been so much talk about words like abolish police, defund police, in the now 3 years following George Floyd's murder. And why don't you, Judge Natalia, to sort of reflect on what those terms mean to our community, and is it really going to further or not further perhaps the goals that we have to basically, I think we can all agree that a major objective that we have is to reduce harm, right, to our communities. Tell us what, from your perspective, what those terms mean.
So as a citizen, and before I was a judge, observing what happened in George Floyd, there was an immediate, massive community response, right? People were mad, and people organized, and people showed up on the streets for days across the country and even internationally to protest what had happened. And for a minute, it seemed that there were some really powerful, bold talks of change, of systemic reform, of are we using our resources correctly is another way of saying, what folks were marking as defund. And it felt like just as quickly it got crushed by leaders at every level in our government and in anyone who has a voice, right? Just saying folks that are the protesters are dangerous. The police unions came out harsh, and from my position then becoming a judge in that time frame where we had this golden era of reform for a hot minute, as a judge who enforced bail laws and ensuring that people receive their constitutionally protected right to a bail that they could make, notwithstanding their money situation, huge backlash. Yes. I mean, every judge who started, when I started, I stayed on the news. Release this criminal, release this criminal, release this criminal. And it was a really violent and scary, I felt unsafe. Of course. Not from the criminals. I felt unsafe because I was getting messages threatening my family and saying, well, I hope that happens to you so that you know what it's like, right? People called me a communist, wetback judge.
Unbelievable.
And it was, what's scary about the response is that things that I think that we took for granted as being fundamental to our justice system were suddenly called into question, right? People's right to be free before trial. And then who was the culprit, right? Like now judges who used to be pretty anonymous as far as because we don't take positions, because we enforce, we're suddenly in the news, being named, being targets. Talk about discouraging, right? And just coincidentally, in 2018 in Harris County, 19 Black women were elected judge. And alongside that, a handful of Latinas. And in 2020, an even more small handful of Latinas. And so our urban makeup of judges are democratically elected women of color. And it is only then that we start seeing a media narrative, a political narrative where judges are causing crime, a wide-scale narrative, right? And so it was really interesting. I just felt like I had my tail between my legs in my first 6 months in office because you're learning the job and you want to defend yourself. And once you're defending yourself, you've lost, right? You're not coming at it like, no, actually, the news media story should say the judge followed the law. How is that news? You know?
Right.
And so I just think my comment on the movement is actually what I think was the scariest thing about George Floyd was how quickly the response to the activism and organizing that came out of it came, how strong it came, and a lot of really important laws got passed. You know, it's now a felony to protest and block a roadway in Texas, where it wasn't before. It was a misdemeanor.
Right, you said the backlash has been immense, and it's been felt at all parts of the country. I was saying earlier to my colleagues here in New York State, we were able finally, after decades of advocacy, to pass bail reform laws that, you know, acknowledge that you shouldn't be locked up waiting trial because you can't afford to pay, right? Fundamental. And just as quickly, the backlash and the pushback of those bail laws. And again, it also speaks to the power of police and police unions, how quickly they will vilify publicly anyone who is trying to find more sane ways to approach policing in our community. I will say, you know, talking to Latinos, Latinas in the community, including even my own family members, my tias, you know, like about, you know, there are people who get really scared about the idea of defund police, you know, like, well, we need the police to protect us. And this is, I think, an opportunity for education in a very, you know, compassionate and respectful way of our community. Like, well, do the police really help us? Do they really help our community? I was saying earlier that, mentioned earlier that one of the current lawsuits we have is against a police department for failing to provide language access to Spanish speakers. And I mean, we have like audio tapes of women, Latinas, Spanish speakers calling, you know, in distress, you know, domestic violence situation, landlord harassment, speaking in Spanish, and officers literally saying, to this day, this is America, you have to speak English. Who are the police serving? And it's this process to say, these police they have like the biggest budgets. They have huge amounts of money. They get military armaments. But are they responding to the woman who's calling because her husband is beating her up? No. And I think that's like an important teaching opportunity. You know, Maritza, there is something called the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that, you know, is in Congress. What can you tell people a little bit about what it is and what are his chances of getting passed?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, but I do want to remind people that, you know, George Floyd's death was trying to be justified by saying that they found fentanyl in his system. It's just another way that we see the drug war show up, even in death. And I also think about the fact when there were uprisings across the country, who was deputized? It was the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. It was Customs Border Protection, CBP. It was every law enforcement agency you can think of, National Guard on top of state and local law enforcement. So I just want people to like be conscious of that because I can't help but remember all of that.
Yep.
During that time is a very interesting time to be a national advocate in DC because, you know, you had the Trump administration, but you had in Congress a Democratic majority in both chambers. And for the first time, you saw real commitment to getting police reform done. So as an advocate, very naive, but I was very hopeful. I was very hopeful that we were actually going to get something through. And those efforts resulted in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. This was a very comprehensive bill that attempted to do a lot. So, for example, it attempted to rein in problematic policing practices like the use of chokeholds, the use of no-knock warrants. It tried to get rid, or I should say diminish the power of a program called the 1033 program, which I'll probably talk about later. It tried to end racial profiling, which is very ambitious. I don't really know how you do that legislatively. But it tried to do a lot of good things, but ultimately, in order to get bipartisan support, in my opinion, and in the opinion of the Drug Policy Alliance, it fell short of where it needed to be. And there were a few sticking points. One sticking point I know we'll talk about later was around qualified immunity. That was a huge sticking point that there was a lot of disagreement around. So ultimately, the bill sort of just kind of fell apart. And I do want to talk about qualified immunity for a little bit because
Please.
What's interesting about that is that it was such a sticking point because of the role of police unions. Police unions have a lot of power. They have a lot of power federally as well. They are lobbying all the time. They are talking to whoever is in charge of the White House, no matter what party is in charge. And it was this issue around qualified immunity that, again, resulted in really the coalition, the Civil Rights Coalition, sort of falling apart. I will say there's an unnamed civil rights coalition in DC that has a lot of power, but they also represent police unions in addition to other groups. So it was a really tricky time. But just a reminder of what qualified immunity is. It's this idea that you can't hold an officer civilly responsible for police violence because there isn't a similar case in their jurisdiction with the exact facts. So it's really hard. It actually really is hard to hold police accountable, both civilly and criminally. It rarely happens. So that was really unfortunate. Ultimately, the bill did not go far enough, again, from the Drug Policy Alliance perspective. And unfortunately, I've always seen criminal justice reform and police reform similar to immigration, where it's just so polarizing to do that type of work and to find any middle ground, because lawmakers like to talk about these issues as red meat issues. The first thing they want to talk about in an election is immigration, drugs, crime. They may be very pessimistic, but sometimes I feel like they're not even trying to find a solution because they're going to lose talking points in an election. So it's really frustrating. So unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see movement around the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act for quite some time because you have people who are thinking, oh, this is fine, this is a good bill. You have others who are saying this is not sufficient and we need to meet the moment, especially for the first time where we had so much energy for police reform. And then you have the other side that is actually not willing to honestly engage.
Thank you. Yeah. Did you want to add something? Please go ahead.
There was a law passed by our wonderful state legislators after there was, defund became popular, which was an anti-defund bill. And I know Harris County in particular tried to shift some of the budget into hospital-based violence intervention programs. Hopefully y'all are familiar with that, right? But on the point of we want other folks who are better qualified sometimes to handle situations, maybe a domestic violence situation, right? We want a person who's experienced it to go to a hospital to receive treatment, to receive counseling, and for that to be the intervention instead of necessarily incarceration, separation, and all of the things that come from that. But the rule was that no jurisdiction could reduce their amount of funding towards law enforcement or else they would lose their state funding. And that it had to, if there was any increase, there has to be parity across all those agencies that I listed for you all. So you can't just raise like HPD's budget, right, or the county sheriff's office budget. You have to also raise all 7 constables' budget and the district attorney's office's budget. And so that was Texas's response to the defund movement. And the Texas population is 45% Latino.
Wow.
Circling back to how it impacts our community.
My God. Yeah, so much here. I wanted to just briefly go back to picking up on the conversation, what you started talking about, Maritza, about qualified immunity, under the sort of larger umbrella issue of how difficult it is to hold police accountable for misconduct and for violence against our community. Qualified immunity, yeah. I mean, Erwin Chemerinsky, who's like the master of Supreme Court jurisprudence, every year I sign up for the 6-hour Dean Chemerinsky review of Supreme Court cases, and I feel like just so well informed. I mean, he has written extensively in the last couple of years about it's nearly impossible to hold police accountable for what is qualified immunity. Is a completely judge-made doctrine. It is not a statute, and so it gives immense power. And another thing you mentioned, Maritza, the power of police unions. They are incredibly powerful, and they use the process of negotiating for negotiating new collective bargaining agreements to ensure that police, if there is an incident, especially a violent incident, that there are like incredibly insane protections in my view for police. So you'll have contracts where a police officer, no one can talk to them for like days about after the incident. That they get to, if there's any like camera footage, that they get to review the camera footage before they give an official statement. All sorts of protections like that. But it's just even the act of not being able, of like civilians not being able to discipline police officers, suspend them, and terminate them if need be, that I think really contributes to this feeling like that they have all this power and they're not being held accountable. Switching gears for a moment, I did want to talk, and I have to take advantage of the fact that you are in Texas. And you mentioned this also, what we call crimmigration, the intersection between immigration and the criminal legal system. What have you guys seen in your work?
Yeah, so I would say, Texas is considered by some to be ground zero for this sort of thing. I talked about taking on this job because I was inspired by or disgusted by illegal reentry being a federal crime, and we have just passed a law in the state of Texas making illegal entry and illegal reentry a state crime. There is a showdown right now between federal and state officials with regards to who can enforce the border. We passed legislation for $1.5 billion to go towards continuing a wall. That $1.5 billion had previously been invested in. And I saw Ms. Irma from the Mexican American Legislative Caucus here. The folks that were against it were fighting so hard, and they succeeded at holding off on the legislation, and then the governor called special session after special session, meaning they make all the legislators come back until their priorities get passed. But it is, it's a fight in federal court, but it's now illegal in the state of Texas for persons to illegally enter and re-enter. Before that, we had the government conducting Operation Lone Star, where they were authorizing private citizens to prosecute people for trespassing on their property, and people were having court in parking lots. And so there was a lot of really important due process issues that were coming up. People were being detained, incarcerated without really having a court, and so that happened.
Mm-hmm. No, we're on the ground because you mentioned Operation Lone Star. Mm-hmm. So we have advocates in the ground as well. And I mean, one thing that really what strikes me first of all is also like the number of different law enforcement agencies that are literally tripping over each other. But at the same time, I have to say this because it goes to the theme again, are police really serving our community? Because it's a valid question, a valid concern about like why we can't defund police and abolish policing. One of my advocates caught video that actually went viral of she was on a canoe, a kayak in the river, in the Rio Grande, and caught video of a woman carrying a baby who was literally going under, calling for help. There was a motorboat with CBP right there, and they did nothing to like help her, like stop her from going under. So again, we have to really question, are the police really serving us and demand that they serve us at the same time that we try to, curb back their power and hold them more accountable. Maritza, have you encountered any, like, what is your this idea of crimmigration? How has that shown up in your work?
It shows up all the time. I think I'll talk about it in the reverse. I think you were talking more about like what you're seeing immigration-wise. What I see a lot is people who get involved with the criminal justice system and then face immigration consequences. In fact, the Drug Policy Alliance is working with Human Rights Watch on updating a report that first came out in 2015 that shows how, again, drugs are used as an excuse to detain and deport people. Any drug offense can result in automatic detention and deportation for people who are non-citizens. So we see that quite often, actually. Drug possession alone continues to be a driver of deportation in this country. So people who are non-citizens are really at risk. I think one way that we see this show up actually quite prominently here in California and other places that have legalized at least some substances like marijuana, is around the fact that people may think that they're complying, and they probably are. They are complying with state and local laws, but they don't realize that because some of these substances are on the federal drug schedules, that they could face criminal justice consequences. Marijuana is a big example of that, and I'm talking about that because right now there's a lot of discussion at the federal level to move marijuana from Schedule I to a Schedule III drug. That's not going to matter to people who are non-citizens. As long as marijuana remains anywhere on the CSA, people will continue to face automatic detention and deportation for any sort of marijuana activity, even if you're a medical marijuana patient, even if you're working in the industry, which we see a lot, people who are just working in the industry and think that they're in total compliance, and they are in total compliance with state law. But because of marijuana status as a Schedule I drug, or not even Schedule I, on the CSA, they still face those really intense consequences. I think the most tragic part of my work is that I often see a lot of people who serve time in prison and then are automatically put on the path to deportation. Right. So it's like double punishment. Those are the toughest, right, the toughest things to see, for sure.
Maritza, you actually provided the great segue into the last 15 minutes of our panel discussion, which is where we're going to be talking about your questions, because the first question I had up here was, do we think there will be a time when marijuana possession will not be considered a federal crime, and are there other ways we can protect immigrants from marijuana charges and the subsequent immigration consequences?
Yeah, we need to push for non-citizens to be included in any sort of federal marijuana relief. I was very disappointed that when the Biden administration announced these pardons for federal marijuana reform, that one, it was only people who had federal convictions, which is like no one, because most people are there not for simple marijuana possession cases, they're there for more complicated marijuana-related cases. But also, they purposely left out non-citizens from any sort of relief, which is very damaging because of the immigration consequences that I talked about. We need to make sure that any type of drug policy reform, and at the Drug Policy, we're very conscious of this at Drug Policy Alliance, making sure that we include non-citizens, that we work hand in hand with immigrant rights activists, with non-citizens themselves, immigration attorneys, to get the law right. I think a good example of this is a federal marijuana bill that we've now twice passed in the House called the MORE Act, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. There's also a similar bill in the Senate called the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act. Both bills would deschedule marijuana, completely removing it from the CSA. But on top of that, it would also restore rights to people who have had criminal justice involvement, but also non-citizens who have had criminal justice contact because of marijuana. It would ensure that they no longer face immigration consequences, and in fact, there would even be a way for people to come back, to petition to come back if they've been deported for such crimes. So we need federal marijuana reform. Unfortunately, that's probably going to have to come through legislation in Congress. I think we're a ways away from that, but we should use what's happening with the Biden administration scheduled review order on marijuana to push Congress to do more. It might not be this year or next Congress, but each Congress, you got to push. That's how progress happens.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. We have some great questions here. Okay, next question. What is the role of prosecutors in ending racial profiling and police abuse in Latino communities? Awesome question. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so I had a friendship with one of the chief prosecutors in my court, and she was very good about not only taking the appropriate action in the court when there was an issue with how a stop or a search happened, but she testifies in disciplinary hearings for police all the time.
Interesting.
She makes calls to get people fired. And so they are very powerful in educating the police about what the laws are, what the constitutional protections are, and in taking actions to make sure that our decisions under the law actually have a trickle-down effect and can potentially extend into the agency. So they have tremendous power in individual cases at the very least.
That's amazing about what your friend and colleague did. It's very affirming to hear that. because I'm sure she also puts herself, at risk, at the same kind of risk that you put yourself every day as being a judge from being bullied and called out by the police. It's really tough. Next question. How do we ensure the voices of Black Latinos are part of the conversation of police abuse? Great question. At my office, LatinoJustice, we have been spending a lot of time this past year talking about anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism within the Latino community. It's something that we absolutely need to be talking much, much more about. And I think, part of it is to, I think, just as a community, recognize that it's there and that we contribute to the problem, to the anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, and that, frankly, we need to do more to uplift the special, even worse circumstances that a lot of Afro-Latinos are facing when they are interacting with all aspects of the criminal justice system. Any thoughts that you?
Yeah, so having worked at a nonprofit that did civil rights litigation, I'll just reflect that I saw firsthand how quickly folks that do our work, and you all are going to be Latino lawyers and judges and advocates, the work becomes removed from the people affected. Mm-hmm. And it starts to happen, and then it's just like, wow, where are the impacted people? And then you find yourself looking for the impacted people, right, doing impact litigation or something. And so I would just caution any of you who are interested in the work to make sure that you stay front and center, having, like Jenny was saying in the last panel, right, talk to people, mm-hmm. Let them dictate the movement, and looking out for organizations and supporting organizations that have impacted voices leading the conversation and the work is where it's at.
So, thoughts on redirecting money from police units back into the community? Is it feasible? Yes, it is feasible. It is feasible, and it's what we work as advocates. I know that we, in my job at LatinoJustice, my previous job at the ACLU of New York, there are these amazing advocates who spent so much time in the weeds of state budgets and local budgets, really advocating for, and it's not just, and I'd say it's not just, it's about redirecting money. It's not just taking money from the police, but mm-hmm. saying we're redirecting it. We're redirecting it to civilian response units, people who will train to respond to people in mental health or drug crisis. We're going to redirect it to what our community thinks are better ways to promote community safety. But it really is this laborious, very difficult day in, day out process of fighting over budgets and ensuring that those the police are always going to come in with they're going to use scare tactics. They're going to say, if you take money away from us, this is going to mean less police on the street, less patrol cars. Well, is it really that, or is it you're going to have 5 less tanks to drive around town, right? You have to really challenge what they're saying is happening. I just laugh because we're in New York City right now. We just passed a bill, amazing bill, that requires the police to give to basically provide input data on every stop they make. And people are saying, the police are saying, it's going to be too, cumbersome. It's going to take so much time, and it's going to take so much time away from, fighting crime and get, in New York, I see police standing around most of the day. I'm in Penn Station, I'm in Times Square. Yes, some percentage of time. You're not going to convince me that those police can't spend, 3 minutes on the special app that they spent millions of dollars to create, that they can just input the demographics and a couple of key data points so we can know if they're stopping people. Do you guys have any thoughts, or am I being like you were saying, where it's a two? There's no way we can get money away from all these.
I think it's going to take a lot of education of the public to understand where their money is going, to realize that a lot of your tax dollars go to funding the police and military. I think that's something that we did see that was positive when the George Floyd uprising started, but then we saw a backlash where actually now police departments are more funded than they were before the uprisings, which is really problematic. But I always like to remind people that the safest communities are not the ones that are most police or you see more police. It's the ones that have access to quality education, healthcare, good paying jobs, things that are life affirming. And that's something that we know in the drug policy movement as well. You know, we always say that, you know, we need to invest in things that are life affirming because we know that that is what keeps our communities healthy and safe. It's actually what helps minimize the chance that somebody will fall into problematic drug use as well. So it actually saves people's lives, but also saves money in the long run if you want to even look at it through that lens, right? But yeah, I think it's possible. I think we've seen things already happen. Oregon is a good example of that with the drug decrim initiative that occurred in a couple of years ago, where we saw money being rerouted to harm reduction services for people who use drugs to make sure that people have access to, again, quality health care and treatment versus the criminal justice system.
So it is possible, but it's
possible.
incredibly hard, and you have to be really focused and have a lot of, you know, just people who are willing to do that work and in the budgeting process. Our next question has to do with language access in police departments, and this must be very pertinent where you are, Judge, because like you said, such a high percentage. What percentage of people in Harris County are Latino?
I think it's 43 in Harris.
Wow. So this question is about what trainings are offered to police departments on approaching non-English speakers, and what language access resources do they use, and in your opinion, do they have enough bilingual police officers and other law enforcement staff where you are?
Yeah, I'm a little bit less familiar of the data of the police agency's resources on this. I do think it's getting better just from what I've seen, but I know that, for example, the DA's office doesn't have enough Spanish speakers, and so we'll be waiting months on them to make contact with a complaining witness in a crime.
Wow.
Because they don't have any investigators who speak Spanish or translators.
How is that possible?
It's devastating. And frankly, our courts need help. I'm working on a language access plan. We don't have our court documents translated.
I find that so, disheartening, partly because, as many of you know, now we have more Latinos who are coming from Mexico and Central America who do not speak Spanish as their primary language, but speak an indigenous dialect. Like, I think ICE has reported that there's something like 25 to 30 indigenous dialects being spoken in immigration courts from Mexico and Central America. And imagine how isolated they are. If we can't even get in this country now adequate translation interpretation services for people in Spanish, imagine if you're in that situation. You have no chance, really no chance. Next question about police training had to do with, are police trained in unconscious biases and DEI?
My state just outlawed DEI.
So that answers your question, right? I'm sorry. I'm like the AV people are probably really mad at me because I keep doing this. Hold on. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because a lot of, I guess, in the 90s and the early 2000s, a lot of police litigation really focused on, like DOJ litigation, like as part of the settlements, would feature prominently training on unconscious bias. And I think a lot of us could agree that that just really has not been at all successful. And I think part of it is also something we have not talked about, is that doing that in the face of the reality that white supremacy is ingrained in a lot of law enforcement agencies. I think we're just beginning to grapple with that. So, like, ordering someone in police to undergo that kind of training when we haven't really gotten to the root of what's a bigger issue, a bigger problem that is historical and goes back centuries is really problematic. We have time for one more question. Here, let me see. I don't know. I'm going to do something really fun here. Given the current political climate, what recommendations do you have for all of the justice advocates in the room about what we could be doing to focus our efforts to have the biggest impact? Go.
So mine is actually going to be really simple, but I think it makes a huge difference. It's just to remember to use humanizing language when we talk about people who have been involved in the criminal justice system or people who use drugs. Just like with immigration, right? Like, we don't say illegals. We say, people, like, we humanize people, right? Like immigrants or, people who are non-citizens, people first language. We try to do the same thing in the criminal justice system. don't say felon, don't say, prisoner. You say somebody who's formerly incarcerated. In drug policy, don't say addict, don't say junkie, don't say crackhead, don't say disparaging things like that. You say a person who uses drugs. Maybe that person has substance use disorder, but unless you're a doctor, you probably shouldn't say that either, unless they let it be known that they have that medical condition. But that's so important to the work that we do, because I see all the time how people are dehumanized in our political and national discourse, and it's harder to build coalitions, it's harder to pass and write progressive policies and laws when that type of discourse is out there, and when people buy it and just throw those words out there without putting thought into it. So I would just say, be conscious of how you speak about people who are marginalized, and remember, people first language is so important.
Judge Natalia.
Yeah, I think something similar. I think keep talking to people that you're purporting to help. As a lawyer, we can sometimes get caught up in the work and in the litigation and in the analysis and the research and writing, and we become too busy for even our own families and our own communities, and that's toxic. I mean, that makes you less accessible and less aware of what the real problem is. I mean, and even like our own Latino racism against, now that Central Americans are, an enormous part of the immigration, like the conversation is changing. So stay connected to folks that you say that you're helping, and continue to redefine that. People first language is great advice.
Yeah, and just to end up, I would say it's about language and narrative change. Maritza was saying earlier that it's true that a lot of Latino groups nationally have not gotten involved in criminal legal system reform issues. Because there's still this narrative out there about the good immigrant and the bad immigrant, right? Like a lot of my work really focuses, my objective is to show the Latino community that the criminal justice system is serving as a form of oppression and keeping our growing power down, just like voter suppression is. That we have to like see it and not be ashamed of it. There's the real factors and forces that are drawing our people into the system, just like they're forces that they're keeping Latinos from voting, right? Or keeping them from getting enrolled in schools. And we have to be able to get beyond that good immigrant, bad immigrant narrative to really see progress in this area. Well, please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists. Thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of you over the next couple of days in all the different places. Thank you so much. See, we have that.